All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. It's great to have so many folks interested in our Better Together webinar series. This third edition of the webinar series is focused on housing in the Richmond region, and I'm really excited that we have a great set of panelists to talk about different cooperative efforts happening in the region. Just as a reminder, we kicked this Better Together webinar series off last winter and have so far been able to focus on the good work that's happening in the emergency management community, among our education foundations, and now among some of the leaders in the housing arena here in the Richmond region. This session is going to be a little bit different than maybe other sessions that folks have tuned into about affordable housing. We're not as much talking about the issue itself, but more about the partnerships that exist in the region to be able to address affordable and fair housing needs in the community. So looking forward to this, and I'm grateful to my colleague, Mark Bittner, who's going to be facilitating this session. I know he'll be introducing the speakers, but thanks to everybody for tuning in, and we look forward to a great conversation. So Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Martha. As she said, I am going to introduce our speakers. I'll give a little brief introduction for each of them. We have Jovan Burton, who is currently Director of Implementation for the Partnership for Housing Affordability. We also have Carol Dunlap, who works with Goochland Cares as their Family Services Director. David Sachs from Henrico County, he is their Community Development Manager. And we also have Heidi Aguilar, who is the Managing Director for Root Policy, who's been conducting an analysis of impediments project for the Richmond region. I will let each of you all add to that if you would like, and if that's okay, I'll start off with Jovan. If you have more you'd like to share about yourself.
No, I mean, I think Mark, I think you hit the highlights. I'm sure I'll talk much about the framework and kind of everything that our organization is doing as we get through the conversation.
All right, great, thank you. Carol, would you like to add anything?
Well, no, just a little bit about Goochland Cares. We are a mid-sized nonprofit out in Goochland. We have 13 programs, probably 3 of them, or maybe 4 of them, we cover under the framework of housing. Most of them homeless prevention and then homeless programs. But what I'm talking about today is going to be around our efforts working with the community on creating a vision for comprehensive housing in Goochland.
Thank you, Carol. David, please describe yourself.
Oh, that's a tall order, Mark. I'm the Community Development Manager with the Henrico County Department of Community Revitalization. And one of my responsibilities is to oversee the federal entitlement funds that come through HUD, federal government, and of the localities that are members of Plan RVA. It's Henrico, Chesterfield, and Richmond that are entitlement communities that also, we all receive these funds. And the project I'm going to talk about is this cooperative approach we put together with 3 additional localities, the Tri-Cities localities, Petersburg, Colonial Heights, and Hopewell. And because they are also entitlement communities. And so we all have this requirement that we had to do. So quite some time ago, we decided to all do it together.
Great, thank you. And following up on that, Heidi, if you'd like to add a little bit about yourself as well as that project.
Sure, thanks, Mark. I'm Heidi Agler. Nice to meet everybody. I run a women-owned consulting firm actually out of Denver, Colorado. We work nationwide, and we do fair housing studies, which we'll talk about today, housing market analyses, community needs assessments, focus a lot on economic equity, and had done a fair housing study in the Baltimore region before we were selected to do the study in the Richmond region. And so we worked, did a lot of the research, helped manage, working with Mark and his team, the jurisdictions that were participating in this effort. I'm happy to be here today.
Great, thank you. Well, let me just set the general agenda today, as we are going to be talking about housing and all of the issues that might come along with it. Housing is a complex matter, especially in a region with a mix of urban, suburban, and rural communities. I know each of you have done a lot of work in that area, and I'd like each of you to go in depth into certain aspects and programs you've been involved with. And Jovan, if it's all right, I'd like you to talk more in detail about the Richmond Regional Housing Framework.
Absolutely. So our organization launched the Regional Housing Framework in January of 2020, really to serve as kind of a regional housing strategy here for Henrico, Hanover, Chesterfield, the town of Ashland, and the city of Richmond. And so we kind of came together working with representatives from each jurisdiction, in addition to nonprofit developers and other stakeholders in the region to figure out kind of what the priorities were, what the needs were, looking at data, looking at community needs, and then also pairing that with solutions. And so we launched that in January of 2020, and we've been working with local governments and many stakeholders over the last year to work on implementing some of those solutions and seeing how, from a regional standpoint, we can really cooperate on some of these efforts. Because I think one of the biggest things to come out of the framework was this idea that recognizing that housing challenges do not stop at jurisdictional lines. And so with that in mind, I think we've seen a lot of great collaboration over the past year and a half, 2 years along the housing front. And it also provides a platform for jurisdictions to communicate with others on, what efforts they're working on, how they were successful, how that could maybe be replicated in their jurisdiction according to their specific needs. And so we are really excited about a lot of the work that's been done. We just released an annual report, just kind of updating the progress of what's been done here locally and what's to come in the coming year. And so we're really excited about just all of the excitement and collaboration that's been brewing around housing, because I think that it's essentially shown its head with the pandemic of how important it is to stability for households. Because without housing, really everything else falls apart, is what we've seen through talking with residents that have been impacted, talking with service providers. And so very excited that these conversations are happening more and more, and certainly on a regional level. And I think collaboration is very vital to this issue of housing.
All right. Thank you very much. Carol, you work with Goochland Cares, and maybe people aren't always aware of the housing issues that are in a place like Goochland. Can you talk more about what you do and what are some of the issues you face on a daily basis?
Sure. So Goochland is definitely a unique county. It is rural in nature. There is a lot of disparity. The East End butts up against Short Pump and Western Henrico County. There's a lot of wealth concentrated. Concentrated's a loose term when you're talking rural, but it's a lot of wealth and a more dense, higher density in the eastern part of the county. The further west you go, there is, it becomes more rural, less wealthy, less resourced. In the western end of the county, it's considered a food desert, whereas, and there's no broadband available. So it truly is very much more rural in nature than the eastern part. So that brings interesting dynamics. That brings $1 million homes in parts of the county and falling down shacks in other parts of the county. And to a large degree, but not exclusively, that's geographic from the east end to the west end. But certainly there are pockets throughout that have that disparity. There's about 8,000 units of housing in Goochland. And I'm not going to start spouting stats because I'll get them wrong. So I'll talk about the process of where there are folks in Health and Human Services and are more folks who work with more vulnerable communities that know that there are lots of folks who are challenged by housing issues. And that there are lots of folks who, as Jovan talked about, that are just not stable. Their children aren't stable, their families aren't stable because of housing. A couple of years ago, this was pre-COVID, so we'll just say a couple of years ago, we were approached by the county. Certainly we were aware, but we were approached by our then county administrator, who said, I see this firsthand. I understand that there's some disparity here. We are not able to move this forward. And they asked Goochland Cares, because of our credibility in the county, to facilitate a housing discussion. And that has turned into what is now Housing GVA. We are a month away, I'm going to say a month, maybe 2 at the outset, of having a completed needs assessment. And Mark was part of this effort of really trying to dig into the data. And what we found is we could find lots of data, but we didn't know then how to turn that into a story, to form vision, and inform our stakeholders about what the needs are. So that's our starting. I don't know if that might be enough now.
Sure.
Yeah.
And thank you very much. I'm hearing a theme of housing affordability, housing quality. Talk a bit, if you can, about, it seems that this is something that happens everywhere. It's not something that's only concentrated in a city. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So when people think of Goochland, they're surprised often to learn that there's homeless folks in Goochland. They're surprised about homelessness. They're surprised about that we literally have houses that have holes in the roof where it's snowing into the living room. We have an undetermined number of housing without indoor plumbing. We have lots and lots of needs. We also have, on the other end of the spectrum, like I said, $1 million homes in gated communities, and there's less in between. So we absolutely, very common issues. None of those things that I said you don't see in Richmond City, nor do you see in Henrico. I think it is a surprise when people think of that in Goochland because of the wealth that's associated with Goochland. So I think that's surprising to people. I think the difference might be the kind of places people are living are not necessarily abandoned buildings, but places like barns. Served a young man who literally his father moved him into the barn and he was sleeping on the barn floor. People sheds in the back, trailers that are just not livable. I think that it looks a little different than it does in the city, but the issues are the same, that people are in unsafe housing, unsafe dwelling, unsafe shelter.
Thank you for that. Well, considering that this is an issue that can take place anywhere, that leads us into another main point of today's discussion, which was regional collaboration and how communities can work together to hopefully address these issues. So with that, I'd like to hear a bit from David and Heidi. If you could describe the analysis of impediments project, and perhaps talk about how it became a group project involving several localities.
Okay, I'll be happy to kick that off for you, Mark. So one of the conditions upon receiving the federal entitlement funds, and the most common is the Community Development Block Grant funds, and those are received by, as I mentioned, Henrico, Chesterfield, Richmond, Hopewell, Petersburg, and Colonial Heights, is all of any recipient of these funds has to certify that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing choice. And that's a requirement. And in order to do so, there has been a requirement that these recipients prepare a document that is known as an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. Now, given a little bit of sort of changes in policy at the federal level between really beginning with the Obama administration and then into the Trump administration, this requirement sort of changed and vacillated back and forth a little bit and caused a pretty decent amount of confusion. But in the end, what happened is it was determined that we all have to do this. I've been through this, once before with Henrico, a couple of times when I was working with the city of Richmond, working with the federal entitlement funds as well. And so when I realized that we're all doing this, we can all pay a consultant or do it in-house. Or at the time when I first got involved with this, I saw some examples around the country where the regions came together and did this collectively. And I began to realize this makes perfect sense for a whole variety of reasons. Number one, there's almost no such thing, at least in my mind, as a local housing market. It's all regional. When you have people of various incomes, everybody, shops for housing, on a regional level. This is where your commuting patterns are. And we like to think that Henrico is a community of choice when it comes to where people like to reside. But we're really not the only community of choice, even folks. So housing is a regional market for one thing. The second thing is, it didn't seem to make sense to me for 6 localities, 5 of whom had this document due at the same time, to basically replicate this effort. If we hired consultants or we did this in-house, we'd all be interviewing the same housing providers, whether they are private developers or nonprofit partners that are involved in housing. We'd be dealing with sort of the same communities. And what's also pretty darn important is we could save a lot of money and save a little bit of aggravation too. And so beginning about almost in 2018, I started talking to my colleagues in the other 5 localities. I was talking with HUD, and we agreed to, that there's some merit in doing this collectively. HUD sort of backed away from the requirement. It took a little over a year to figure out what in the world was required of all of us. And once that understanding congealed to the extent that it was ever going to congeal, we dusted off this project. And then really working with getting everyone that was involved in this to agree that this is a good idea. We began, it was really sort of putting together, we met monthly, and we sort of reached an agreement on how this would be done. Some of us researched where this is going on in other parts of the country. We had some good models in the Austin, Texas area, in Baltimore, in Oakland, in Utah. I mean, I talked to colleagues probably about 7 or 8 places around the country. So we have ultimately agreed to, that we would do this. Each of the staff of the localities got buy-in from the top administration, say, yes, this is a good thing to pursue. We came up with a cost sharing strategy that was based on 2 variables, which was the population in the locality and the amount of the CDBG entitlement money that came from the federal government, and a few other variables built into the equation. And we agreed to do this. And then for a couple of reasons, one of which is none of us was really enthusiastic about being the lead locality. And usually when we have a regional project like this, somebody has to be a lead locality. I talked to Martha, and Martha thought this was a really good thing for the Planning District Commission to be involved and take the lead. We were all extremely grateful. And so Plan RVA really served as both the fiscal agent for it and also sort of the administrative agent. And the intent was to hire a consultant, and Plan RVA undertook the role of doing all the procurement of the consultant, the interviewing and all of that. And so essentially, Plan RVA is the client for this project, and the contractual arrangement is between Plan RVA and Heidi with Root Policy Research. And then the 6 localities, there was a cooperation agreement that was signed by the city manager, county administrator of all of these, of all the 6 localities. And we all pay, our proportional share based on what's established in that. But I think, and HUD was very enthusiastic about this project, and it's nearing completion. We've all been reviewing drafts of this, and I imagine that Heidi's group will probably have the final draft out in the next month, and the final product within a month or so after that. I think it's going well. It's I'm really happy to be involved in a project that we kind of bought into regionally. I'm happy to work with my colleagues in the other 5 localities. Happy to save everybody a lot of money and everybody a lot of aggravation, and have what I think is going to be a really, really good and helpful product.
Thank you very much, David. And as he stated, yes, Plan RVA is coordinating the effort. And for those listening, if you're interested, the localities that are involved are the city of Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield, and the Tri-Cities of Petersburg, Hopewell, and Colonial Heights, which are technically outside of our Plan RVA boundary. But we have worked with them in the past, and we did make this agreement. And once it was done and we did all of our interviews, we ultimately did choose route policy, which is where Heidi Aguilar works. So Heidi, since you have been doing the actual work for these past 8 months or so, please, if you don't mind, share some of the details of what you found.
Well, I'd be happy to, Mark. And it was a pleasure to work with all the jurisdictions and work with Plan RVA. I wanted to just draw one distinction before I jump in and share some of the top level findings. The analysis of impediments to fair housing choice is not meant to replicate anything that Jovan and his team are working on in terms of regional housing needs. What it does is it takes both a historical examination of the factors that have led to current inequities, but it focuses on disproportionate needs. It also looks at access to opportunity. So in some ways, it's more narrow than a housing market analysis in that it's looking at federally protected fair housing classes, as well as state and local protections, those populations that may have greater needs, the reasons for those needs, and then it looks at access to transportation, employment, education. So it's really taking a very holistic view of community health from primarily from a housing perspective. When the other observation I wanted to make is just how we were really impressed when we stepped into this work, how collaborative your region is relative to many in which we've worked, how dedicated people are, and really the framework under which people engage in housing needs is unusual. So it allowed us to start from a different place. We didn't need to build as much, I would say, sort of commitment and capacity around addressing these needs. So just a compliment to you all for all the good work you've done to get there. When we look at the region and look at both the differences as well as sort of the overall trends in the region, economically, your region's gained a lot over even just the last couple of years. You're less segregated than you have been, and segregation has moved we look at this by different race and ethnicity, has moved from high in many areas to moderate, which is a good trend. When we see those kinds of changes, we want to make sure these are not because of displacement, that people are actually achieving more economic opportunity, that they're having more access to housing choice. That's generally what we saw. Although you have some very significant housing needs, as Carol and Jovan talked about, overall the region's growing in a way that is very positive. You're becoming more diverse racially and ethnically. The African American population, in terms of its proportion of the region, has stayed the same, which is a good thing. So we're not seeing really high levels of displacement displacement, even though there definitely are levels of housing needs or higher level of housing needs. Probably the biggest, most striking finding, I would say, is that the areas that were where people were historically marginalized, under-resourced, we refer to this, sort of the collective, we refer to this as redlining, but it's really more than redlining. The activities that took place to deny people housing choice because of their class, because of their income, because of how they looked. Individuals living in those neighborhoods still face more challenges than what we see in other neighborhoods. So higher levels of poverty, higher loan denials, higher levels of what we call cost burden, and that's where households are paying more than 30% of their gross household income toward housing choice. So just to give you a picture of that, when we look at African Americans in the region, they're more than twice as likely to pay more than 50% of their income in housing choice, to live in substandard housing conditions, to be denied housing choice, both rental or mortgage loans, have lower levels of equity in housing, even if we look at the same type of housing unit in the same type of neighborhood, and then almost 3 times or more than 3 times more likely to get a high cost loan. So these conditions that some people in the region are faced with perpetuate inequities, and that when you think back to what we learned with the Great Recession, when there were a lot of people getting high cost loans, being denied housing, they made choices potentially taking on higher rents than they could afford because they needed somewhere to live. That would perhaps lead to an eviction, which then really perpetuates that cycle of need. So you're not unusual. We see these trends in a lot of regions. I would say they were a little more consistently correlated with historical activities that denied people housing choice than what we see in other areas.
So an impediment to housing can be legal, financial, social. Can you describe some more? What is an impediment that prohibits somebody from buying a house or renting a house?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say an impediment is a word that has a lot of different meanings and takes a lot of different meanings throughout these studies. An easier way to think of it is as a barrier. So some type of factor that creates an unlevel playing field for a certain type of household group.
Okay. And considering that we're here talking about regional collaboration and Plan RVA, our clients and our members are local governments, do you have any suggestions on what local governments might want to look at to help lower some of those barriers?
Yeah, I think the first step is, coming together and looking at this both through your regional housing plan and as well as the analysis of impediments. Looking at housing as a regional issue is really important. David talked about the inefficiencies in, individually contracting with a consultant or doing these housing studies in-house, and those are certainly very great. But trying to address these barriers, particularly for some of your small jurisdictions who are very resource constrained, trying to address these barriers that are very complex, that don't end at regional boundaries, as an individual entity really doesn't lead to sort of the collective impact that you want to see. I think, first and foremost, and I work in housing policy, and so I'm a little biased in this area, but elevating housing policy to the same level that we see transportation policy, economic development, it really is. Housing is an incredibly stabilizing force. And if you can elevate housing and resource housing in a way that help stabilize people. We've learned that, through the pandemic, when we've seen that people have income supports, they do pay rent. That's been tested pretty much everywhere. I also would say, it is very appropriate to ask for the private sector to be your partner in this. Both the banking community as well as the development community, we all have a vested interest in stabilizing housing, preventing cost burden. There's tremendous economic gains to helping people not be cost burdened. So just recognizing that this really is not only a regional issue, but a cross partnership issue.
All right. Thank you very much, Heidi. I'd like to talk some now about both the benefits and the challenges of collaborating and bringing all of these various localities together to address a single issue. I'd like to know what the experience of all of you is, and if you could share some of that with the group. We'll start off with hopefully discuss some of the benefits of collaboration, and I'll just go one by one. Jovan, would you mind perhaps listing or talking about some of those benefits of all of us working together?
Yeah, and some of this will build off of what Heidi was speaking to. But when you look at, the jurisdictions here in the region, outside of the city, housing staff is not something that most of the jurisdictions have. And so that was one of the things that we really were trying to focus in on with the regional housing framework, is that this can serve as a housing strategy for these jurisdictions in which you can pick and choose what meets your specific needs for each jurisdiction, that everyone can kind of move at their own pace and apply what works for them. Because when you don't have that dedicated housing staff, it's really difficult to try to focus on some of those efforts from a policy standpoint, in addition to, all the other things with, the federal grants and code enforcement, many other issues. And so that's been a benefit. I think also, one of the key things to collaboration being successful is having buy-in from the beginning and having participation from those individuals at every step of the process, and just being transparent about it so that you can ensure there aren't any surprises, right? Everybody's been included in the process. And so what you're working on is really just a product of the process that you've created. And another thing I'd want to mention is having folks outside of housing has been important to collaboration. People that work in education, people that work in health, who see the value of housing, and Heidi spoke to vested interests. And we had folks from education, particularly from Reynolds Community College, who spoke to how the number one reason that students were either not completing their programs or having to take out emergency loans was because of housing costs. And so this was very important to them because they're trying to ensure that people are getting the degrees that they're seeking or finishing the programs and certifications, because if they don't, now they're saddled with with debt they didn't previously have, and they still have the same high housing costs. And they don't have the certification that they were trying to get a higher income. And so these issues are really interrelated, and the more that you can branch out and collaborate with folks outside of housing is really going to bode well for this issue moving forward.
So the framework that your agency did, that involves several localities. Is that correct?
Yes, City of Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield, Hanover, and the town of Ashland.
All right. And as well as other entities beyond local governments, it sounds.
Yeah. And we had nonprofit developers and as I mentioned, folks from health and education.
So what were some of the challenges you might have experienced trying to bring that group together?
Challenges, I think, were figuring out what the priorities would be, given that, jurisdictions have different needs. Housing stock looks different in each jurisdiction. Some have, a higher prevalence of manufactured housing than others. Some have an older housing stock. But largely the need, as has been discussed, the need remained the same. You still have cost burden folks. You still have growing senior populations in every jurisdiction, just at different levels. And so I think understanding that we're more alike than we are different, despite some of the makeup of these jurisdictions, that was an initial challenge, but it was something that was kind of a breakthrough when we looked at the data. We looked at really what the core priorities were, and that, again, this is something that you can apply to whatever meets your specific needs as a jurisdiction.
Great, thank you. Carol, real briefly, if I can ask you, I know you work in Goochland. Maybe you don't have as much opportunity to go outside your borders, but if you can, do you have any experience working with other localities or entities on your housing issues?
Sure. So we were able to pull together this group that we're calling Housing GVA. And it certainly includes lots of partners outside the city, the county of Goochland, including Plan RVA. You all have been great partners. Better Housing Coalition, Richmond Regional Housing, and as well as a few developers, folks who have more expertise than we do, but also different perspectives. I approach this, we all approach this from different perspectives. Some, I gave stories of a very human perspective, but there's also zoning perspectives, and there's also water, how do you get water if you build houses? So all of those folks have come together around the table. I'm not sure we are collaborating at a level that some of the other panelists are, just because we're getting started. So right now we're laying the groundwork to really the infrastructure for that collaboration. So I'd say that's where we are.
Again, thank you. When putting together any kind of regional group or collaboration, would any of you have done anything differently or suggest something different versus what's been done in the past?
Mark, what we did, it's a little different. I mean, we worked kind of at the staff level. And I think what worked really well is, we got buy-in at the level which we did, which is the people that manage these programs. And the way I kind of packaged it for everybody was, this will cost you less, this will make your life easier, and you'll get a better product. And you're required to do this, so you can't just ignore it. And so that was a message that I think everybody was able to kind of move up sort of the chain of command in their locality. And, and so I think that message resonated pretty well as a result. And then from there on, it was just, logistics, a lot of logistics, but that was pretty much it.
Yes. And because of the situation in the world right now, it was all done remotely and virtually. Unfortunately, Heidi never got to come to Virginia. She did all of her work from either Colorado, or I believe you said you were in Baltimore today. We would have loved to have hosted you here, but it just never worked out, unfortunately.
And Mark, if I could just, add a couple points to your earlier question about some of the benefits of collaborating. And I just want to point out, in addition to what I point out with regard to our analysis of impediments project, in terms of the administration of these federal entitlement funds, I mean, I talk to my colleagues, particularly in Richmond and Chesterfield, every week. Not a week goes by I don't talk with them. And we're all discussing, we all work with the same partners. We all have similar programs. There are, I can rattle off very easily a half a dozen projects that we have funded together, whether that project is located in Chesterfield, whether it's located in Richmond, or whether it's located in Henrico. And so that's just a really important piece that, to take place. And we can talk about who's funding what and how that works. There are a couple of them where we've entered into MOUs with another locality to understand who's doing some of the, some of the regulatorily required work for HUD. But we, at this level, we talk continuously. And with the receipt of the new CARES Act money that came through HUD, it was really important to be able to kind of use each other's resources to understand how we were going to design some programs, because most of us were working on putting together programs that we've never done before, working with nonprofit providers we've never worked with before, and those providers working on programs they haven't before. So instead of 3 localities or 6 if you had the Tri-Cities areas, 3 localities each inventing a wheel, you had 3 people inventing 1 wheel. And if I have to invent a wheel and everybody steals my wheel designs from me, that's no problem. I mean, that's the way it works, because I'm going to steal their wheel design one day as well.
Right.
And so the fact that we have, these really good working relationships, and we're all doing this at the same time, it's becoming extremely effective. And I really do appreciate being able to, kind of pick up the phone and call any of my colleagues in the three localities here. I do it statewide. I actually do it nationwide all the time too.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, if I could add a little bit to that too, I think that it would have been lovely to see you all in person, and we do a lot of strategic planning, and that works better. I have to be honest. When you're all in a room and there's a lot of nice energy and you can do some activities. But I think virtually this worked really well because of all the jurisdictions and Plan RVA's commitment to this. I do feel like thinking about the collective impact and really what David's talking about is we're in a situation right now in housing policy where for just about forever, we've had, housing's really been a programmatic focus, and shifting away from providing programs to thinking harder about, Carol talked about zoning and land use. Giovanna works on housing policy every single day, but thinking about how do we move the needle, and programs can do some of that, but really it's policy and it's structural intervention that moves the needle. And so some of your smaller communities, they've got one person who's trying to, administer all these programs, work on the reporting compliance, and they just, they don't have the luxury of tackling these issues from a policy framework. So having Henrico County and Chesterfield County and the city of Richmond really, lead and mentor and demonstrate what a policy focus can look like, collectively, I think that moves a region into that. I mean, I can see that you all are there much more so than a lot of our clients, partially because you've been working on it. You've got a lot of good institutional capacity, but it helps you collectively move into a policy framework as opposed to jurisdictionally trying to do this on your own, which is really hard. It's a big barrier, I think, for a lot of our clients. So compliments there, and I think there's a lot of what I'm trying to say is subtle and intangible positive effects that come from these collaborative processes that never get captured on paper and really aren't, as transparent as maybe they should be.
Let me go back to the subject of housing itself and affordability. When you describe or talk about affordable housing, are you talking about a certain price? Are you talking about a certain type? Or could it be both? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can take the first stab at that. I mean, I know that language is important, and it's very important to be clear about what we're discussing. I think we typically try to focus on, this is really an issue of there's not enough housing for every income level. That's the reality. So it's not a certain price you're looking at, is that you want folks to not be cost burdened. And the majority of folks that are cost burdened are spending over 30% of their income on housing are those who are lower income, below 80%, below 50% of area median income. And that's going to go higher and higher the lower you get along the income spectrum. So it's really about having a variety of housing types available for folks who are in those income levels, because that's what doesn't exist at the moment.
Any other thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Carol.
Well, I'll just, I think that is the term affordable housing comes with lots of stigma, lots of, certainly, and I'll speak from a rural county perspective. I'm sure this is true in most jurisdictions, but certainly it's for often, I hear fear. We're moving, poor people in, or we're creating something for that's high density. I think often affordable housing equates in many minds as high density, which equates to high crime, which equates to unstable neighborhoods. And so we have really been careful about trying to use that term broadly, and really looking at that balance between meeting the needs of the folks in our community who need, just like Jovan said, whatever, the diversity of housing, so that folks are stable, that folks' children are getting good educations that aren't getting interrupted from having to move 3 or 4 times a year. And that it is a broad range of housing, not just one concept. Affordable for me is not necessarily affordable for you. So it's really matching this housing stock availability to the needs in the community.
Thank you.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, Mark, I mean, because Jovan gave the best, summary of what affordable housing is that you can possibly come up with. But we usually like to talk about, add another adjective to that. And we like to add the word decent or safe, affordable housing, because I could run a lot of numbers for you for Henrico County and based on housing values and stuff and say, look, we've got tons of affordable housing, but we also have a significant amount of housing, particularly some older single family homes that really could use some work. I was even in some this morning. And so, it's more than just a dollars and cents thing. But, Jovan's, sort of 30% is probably the best, across the board description. But we usually most of us in this business always like to throw that additional adjective in there, decent, affordable housing.
Yeah, and I agree because I think that that's a misnomer as well as the quality side of it. I mean, what's being built today, the kind of products we're talking about are very high quality, and oftentimes they have design standards that are more rigorous than what you would find for a market rate deal. That just requires them to be of strong quality, have environmental standards that just other developments don't have. And so I think that's something that also is a misnomer out there regarding kind of what the quality of the product will be.
All right, thank you. So getting back to our themes of housing and collaboration, what do you think are the next steps that we perhaps should take to address those issues here in our region, and what perhaps new partnerships might help in that effort? Does anybody have?
Mark, I'll jump in quickly, and then I need to apologize. I've got to go to another meeting in a couple of minutes, so I'll take my couple minutes here, a couple 30 seconds. I think that it's just moving forward into implementation, and what we see really effective in a lot of smaller regions, granted, but when we work in a regional capacity, if we see some type of consistent leadership and organization or group of people who have the directive to move policy forward, that's where we see a lot of success. And sometimes that comes in the form of setting a regional goal, and then individual jurisdictions are managing to that, or putting together a working group, and they are the leadership group that moves policy forward, presenting to your local leaders, your commissioners, your council members, and providing them with a consistent message, which, I know Jovan and his group have been working on, about committing to policy and how it's going to move forward, and then sticking with it. It takes a while to achieve these results, but when you see that housing achieving and goals in housing policy really doesn't make a big difference. It just takes a few years to get there. I think you're definitely on the right track. You're doing all the right things. It's just implementation and commitment that I think is really important as you move forward.
Thank you very much, Heidi. We appreciate all the efforts you've done in the region over the past year. Good luck in Baltimore. Well, is there anything anyone would like to add that perhaps they didn't get a chance to say earlier?
So I guess I'll say, and this is Mark, your what's next question as well is, again, in Goochland, I feel like we're just getting started. Not that there haven't been lots of committed citizens in the past who have worked on these issues. We're certainly not the first. We might or might not be the most collective and the most collaborative. I haven't been around for 50 years like some of our community members have. But for me, what's next is really building a consensus on what our neighbors, what people in our community, what our bottom lines are around housing and what people deserve as human beings, and then figuring out how to promote that, how to move that forward, how to make sure our community is living up to the values around housing that we want to meet. I think that's may or may not be easier in a small jurisdiction. And it sounds very not policy. It sounds like values, but my work in this community has told me it's a very generous, caring community. And so, how do we layer that? And we're about to finish a needs assessment. Our first draft was published yesterday for the committee to consider. And so, how do we take that to that next step of meeting our values? And those are collective, collaborative values, not my personal values or anybody's personal values, but our collective community values. That sounded really good, so I'm going to quit.
Mark, the only thing I would add is that I think most elected officials in this region and most folks in the business understand that there's an enormous gap, as Javon's work is involved in, an enormous gap in terms of where we'd really like to be in terms of making sure every household in this region has safe, affordable housing and the resources available at the local government level to get there. I mean, that's just a fact of life, and it's just not going to change. And that gap is enormous. Mm-hmm. And so what's happening, at the local level is we're all kind of working within the dynamics of what the market's allowing to have happen or not happen, which changes and evolves over time. And so those, at the local government, I can speak in terms of, with the federal funds, a little bit of the other funds is so local government's all being strategic in terms of where they're placing those resources when it comes to housing. And so when it comes to placing the financial resources, and I can speak like in Henrico with the federal funds, each year with our federal entitlements funds, we're spending, $2 million or so of those of almost $3 on housing, maybe more than that when you talk about the homeless programs. So we're spending a huge chunk of our federal entitlement funds on housing, far more than we're required to do, and focusing it in what is that need that's in Henrico that the community has told us is a big priority. And one of those huge priorities is dealing with the conditions of existing housing for very low income folks, and particularly low income disabled citizens and senior citizens. And so your local government is going to focus on what what their citizens are telling them as priorities, because you're just not going to be able to do everything. But at the same time, trying to take actions to help encourage the development. And in all the localities, most local governments are trying to encourage, high quality, sustainable housing that's available for the, particularly sort of this missing middle and the upper end of the lower income. The very, very low housing for the very, very lowest income really can, something requires just continuous support, which local governments aren't in position to do.
Mm.
And that's something the federal government really has to step in and provide. And so I think that's, all of the localities are kind of approaching slightly different ways. I think we're all trying to nibble away at the problem. If we can take bigger bites, we do. But the unfortunate reality, and Javon can tell you the numbers. There's a big gap between where most people would like to be and the reality of getting there.
Yeah, and I'll just say, building on that, that's kind of what I was going to speak to, David, is, at its core, this is really about, for local governments, is finding what your role is with this, because the issue of housing is, development costs X, your sources of funds are Y, and there's a big gap between the two, and closing the gap is how we figure out how to solve the problem. So it's just a matter of, for local governments, what's their role in closing that gap? Is that role an enabler where you're using land use and zoning to help create an environment that makes it easier to develop the housing that you're looking to develop? A funder, a donor, combination of the three. Just really finding what your role is, because it's a very complex issue. It's going to require many more parties than just local governments. So it's just a matter of figuring out what your role is and identifying that.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. This has been very informative. We're getting close to the end of our allotted time, so I wanted to make sure we had some opportunity for question and answer. Martha, do you have any questions that might have come in?
Not yet, but I think now's the time that we'll invite any of the attendees to ask a question if they'd like. So if you have one, you can raise your hand. You can send a question through the chat or the Q&A function, and I will let you address the group directly. Okay, well, you all must have very thoroughly answered so many of the questions. I just wanted to say again, we really appreciate the work that you're doing in the community. I know that you touched on it. Not only is the topic itself a challenging topic to really get your arms around and understand, and it's obviously a deeply personal issue, but we also recognize that it's difficult to work collaboratively, and each one of you have made that an intentional part of the process. So thank you for that. We do have a question now, so I will let Mr. Spoonhauer go ahead and address the group. Mr. Spoonhauer, if you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead.
Hey, everybody. My name is Neil. I just wanted to thank you all for this. This has been great. I'm kind of in an interesting position in that I am a newly elected local official. I'm on the committee that I joined the committee that Carol is talking about, and I was also on the board of Goochland Cares. And I don't think when I was running for office, I truly appreciated or understood the complexity of this issue for a variety of reasons. And when I got on the committee, and we're talking about partnerships, the thing that most attracted me in the beginning, working with Carol and the team, was that it was very clear that this was not an issue that one part of society could solve. So it wasn't just going to be the nonprofit sector. It wasn't just going to be citizen-led. It wasn't just going to be local government or federal government. It takes everybody involved. And the other interesting hat that I wear is that I own an advertising agency. So I bring that up because so often, and I think Carol alluded to this very eloquently in the problems that Goochland has, a lot of people just don't see the problem. It's not necessarily in their backyard, although it could be around the corner from them, and they don't even know it. So I feel like strong public service announcements and a good communication strategy has to be in the forefront of anything that we're doing from a partnership perspective, as well as, again, ensuring that it is a local partnership. When they presented a study that was done, the thing that attracted me to that, it was almost like when they came up with their recommendations, it was, it was a list of 5 different groups, and how each could contribute. Not that, hey, we're just going to put this all on the nonprofit sector or the churches or the local government. It was everybody. So I love the whole theme of the partnership, and I do see, just even freshly into understanding this problem even a little bit more, how critical that is. So thank you so much for all that and for all the work you're doing. Just I do this part-time, and it keeps me up at night. I can't imagine being in there all day long, what that must be like. So thank you for that.
Hi, Neil. Thanks. I'm glad you're listening and contributing, and we'll, figure out that marketing piece as soon as we're ready to go public with the needs assessment.
Well, I know somebody that can help.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I think we have time for just one more. All right. Well, I just want to say thank you again to our panelists and to Mark. Thanks for leading this discussion today. We really appreciate your time in shedding a little bit of light on some exciting efforts that are happening in the region, across the region, and really are focused on some really exciting initiatives. Want to make sure that we make a plug for some of the information. So the analysis of impediments report will be coming out soon, and that will be posted on our website, as well as I would imagine many of the participating jurisdictions' website. As Carol mentioned, they'll be wrapping up a significant portion of the needs assessment in Goochland County, and that will also be available online. And Javon, if I can get you to tell the website information, just this week, there's been a release about an update to the housing framework and where we've been able to achieve results in the last year. So could you share that website with us for the group?
Yeah, I mean, I can put it in the chat, or do you have, maybe you'll send out an email follow up to all the attendees. But yeah, if you go to our website at pharva.com, we have all the framework data there, and all the solutions are available. But in addition, we're kind of embarking on a campaign to just spread awareness around housing and to keep folks updated on what's happening at the local level in each jurisdiction, so folks can sign up to the Housing Matters campaign, as we're calling it, as well.
Thanks so much. And that's www.pharva.com for those that are listening on YouTube. Thanks a lot, everybody. Hope you have a great afternoon. Happy Thursday, and appreciate your time supporting the Better Together webinar series.